Dear professors, colleagues and friends, I am delighted to be with you tonight. I'd like to thank the Director of the British Institute at Ankara, Dr. Lutgarde van der Voet, and Assistant Director, Dr. Daniel MacArthur Seal, for their kind invitation. Also, my thanks to all BIAA staff members who made this talk possible in more practical ways. As the title of my talk reveals, today I will delve into the Ottoman laws on antiquities. Though few publications deal with Ottoman archaeological legislation per se, there is a growing literature on the history of Ottoman archaeology, which help better contextualize legislation. Allow me to mention, by way of illustration, Professor Belgin Özkaya's latest contribution in the field, her recent article at Mukarnas on the Canning marbles. There is also a wealth of primary sources, at the core of which one finds the innumerable archaeology-related documents at the Ottoman State Archives. It is practically impossible to touch upon everything tonight. For this reason, I will limit my discussion to the four main regulations on antiquities, promulgated between 1869 and 1906, and my focus will be on what I believe can help us better understand the essence of Ottoman legal approaches to archaeology. I will thus first investigate hopefully, the goals that each law aspired to achieve and why we moved from one regulation to the other. I will then discuss the content of the laws, the ownership and export of finds, archaeological research, and issues of antiquities protection. It is equally important to turn our attention to how the Ottoman state implemented its archaeological legislation throughout its territories. And finally, after years of looking into this topic, I can confidently say that the Ottoman legislation on antiquities was not an isolated event in the world of archaeology in the long 19th century. Therefore, before I conclude, I'd like to try to locate the Ottoman Empire and its regulations on antiquities in a global context through a comparison with Greece, that is another country of origin for antiquities in the Mediterranean, and Great Britain, the paradigmatic colonial empire of that time, the most advanced country. Goals first. The first Ottoman regulation on antiquities was adopted in 1869. Based on its preamble, we notice two major preoccupations for the Ottoman lawmaker. The first one had to do with the relative position of the state in the international scene. This was a time when the Ottoman Empire was experiencing a dwindling relative position in world affairs. Aware of its wealth in antiquities and their importance for knowledge, the Ottoman Empire wished to project to the world an enhanced image of itself by regulating the field of archaeology. This could be done especially by creating a museum. And this brings us to the second Ottoman preoccupation, that is, the sharing of duplicate finds that could enrich the museum. We understand that the de facto system in place up to that point was to share ancient finds, and especially duplicate ones, between the excavator and the state. However, this system did not work in practice. Duplicate finds were considered rare and often went undeclared, kept hidden from the authorities. This much undermined the ability of the Ottoman state to build its museum collections. The introduction of a regulation on antiquities was expected to contribute in reversing this. And the particular event that triggered the promulgation of the 1869 regulation, Goud's excavations in Ephesus and the way he exported his discoveries, confirms the centrality of the debate on duplicate finds in the museum. So, if we are to sum up, for the Ottomans, the first regulation on antiquities was an effort to improve their standing in world affairs by creating those conditions that would allow them to develop a museum collection equal to that of other advanced countries. The issue of developing the museum was also at the core of the reasons that necessitated the replacement of the 1869 regulation by a new one, just a few years later, in 1874. In fact, the 1869 regulation was considered inadequate in the effort to enrich the museum and protect antiquities against loss. It is no coincidence, then, that the new regulation put so much emphasis on regulating excavations, so much so that in the literature it is likened to an excavation circular, rather than a law that sets regulatory frameworks as one would expect it to be. 10 years later, after the adoption of this regulation, in 1884, a new one replaced it. Here again, the Ottomans were concerned with enriching their own collection of antiquities at the Imperial Museum. They were particularly dissatisfied with what they considered to be a disregard of their regulation by explorers and the great laxity in the export of antiquities afforded to foreign archaeologists. And it is true that excavators were entitled to a third, even two-thirds when owing the land, of antiquities discovered. After 10 years of implementing this system, the Ottoman state had revised its priorities and now wished for all originals to end up at the Imperial Museum in Constantinople, not any foreign state or private collections. In 1906, the Ottoman government introduced what would be the last comprehensive regulation on antiquities. This time, however, it was no dissatisfaction with the stipulations on excavations, sharing or export on antiquities that the 1884 regulation contained. With the 1884 regulation, the Ottoman Empire had devised a more or less satisfactory to its system for dealing with contenders. So it saw no need for stricter rules on, for example, the export of antiquities. And this is why the 1906 regulation practically reproduced the same concepts and regulatory arrangements in this area. Instead, the main reason the 1906 regulation was adopted was the need to update the administration of antiquities in the empire. This new law thus introduced the first clearly delineated Ottoman Antiquities Service, at the top of which one finds the Ministry of Public Education. At its core, there was the Imperial Museum, seconded by a permanent committee. The provincial directors of public education were part of the Antiquities Service at the local level and acted as directors of local museums where these existed. In this new administrative arrangement, there was place even for the customs office. Besides that, other novelties also improved the administration of antiquities in the country. This is, for example, seen in the distinction made in the law between a full-scale excavation, a trial excavation, and a survey. Overall, the Ottoman legislation on antiquities initially aimed to support the creation of a museum and through it to improve the image of the country abroad. Once the museum was solidly established, the main question shifted to what would be the best administrative system for Ottoman archaeology. Now, let's have a look at what the four regulations stipulated with regards to the ownership of finds. The 1869 regulation accorded individual landowners full ownership over all finds discovered in their lands. The 1874 regulation marked a shift towards an explicit state ownership of antiquities. It stated more specifically that all underground antiquities to be discovered belonged to the Ottoman state. It created, however, an opportunity for the sharing of finds, but only in case of authorized excavations. For this, it introduced the concept of the tripartite division of finds between the state, the excavator, and the landowner, each of which was entitled to a third of the artifacts. The shift towards greater state ownership was made manifest in the 1884 regulation, which declared that all antiquities belonged to the Ottoman state, including the ones to be found in the sea, lakes, rivers, and streams. On top of this, the 1884 regulation precluded the sharing of finds, even in case of authorized excavations, with the rights of excavators being limited to making copies, moulage in the French text, and drawings. The 1906 regulation practically repeated the same legal arrangement as its predecessor. And how about exports? In the 1869 regulation, exports were banned, with the exception of coin finds. In the 1874 regulation, exports were made possible but required official permission, while the government retained for itself the right to purchase any item to be exported. In the 1884 regulation, again, the export of finds was conditioned upon official permission. Besides that, for an ancient artifact to be exported, one had to make sure that the Imperial Museum was in possession of a similar one, both in terms of value and kind, and/or that the object to be exported had been previously imported from abroad. The 1906 regulation banned exports completely. So, be it about the ownership of antiquities or their export, the Ottoman regime over time became more restrictive, making finds the prerogative of the state. And evidently, this mostly affected foreign archaeologists working in the empire who wished to export their finds and enrich museums in their home countries. Archaeological research was another field that, like the ownership and export of antiquities, the Ottoman state needed to bring under its control. Between 1869 and 1906, it became regulated in an increasingly detailed manner. The 1869 regulation stipulated that official permission was required to conduct an excavation. Responsible for issuing such permissions was the Ministry of Public Education, which could grant them only for antiquities located underground. There was, however, a way for foreign countries in particular to legally circumvent the ministry by applying directly to the Sultan. This codified in law a pattern which was well known to both the legations in Constantinople and the Ottoman authorities from the previous years, and formalized the regular intervention of embassies on behalf of their subjects. Moreover, this seems to point to an attempt by the Ottomans to ease or at least regulate the pressure exerted upon them by the major powers of that time that pitted themselves against one another in their effort to conquer the past in the Ottoman lands. At the same time, another stipulation shows that the Ottoman Empire was itself ready to take archaeological research in its own hands. This is confirmed by the inclusion in the regulation of an open call for experts on antiquities interested in conducting archaeological research in the empire on behalf of the Ottoman government and with Ottoman funding. The 1874 regulation confirmed the competency of the Ministry of Public Education for dealing with requests for authorization, this time all requests, precluding any direct access to the Sultan. You may also recall that this regulation brings to mind excavation circulars. It is precisely its 18 articles dealing with archaeological research, 18 out of 36 in total, that's half the regulation, to which it owes such a reputation. Let's have a more detailed look to a few of them. This regulation set the maximum duration for a permit to 2 years. It forbade the issuance of permits to civil servants of the Ottoman state or a foreign state for excavations within the boundaries of the area of their jurisdiction. It also limited authorization to one place at a time. Moreover, it defined that excavation permits would be issued by the Ministry of Public Education at referendum to the Sublime Porte. The 1884 regulation essentially maintained the same stipulations as the 1874 regulation regarding archaeological research. The same holds true for the 1906 regulation, that on archaeological research kept intact most of the provisions of the 1884 regulation. In it, though, we do see a more elevated position for the Imperial Museum. For example, in the 1906 regulation, the Ministry of Public Education was no longer required to discuss requests for authorization with the Sublime Porte, but instead with the Imperial Museum. A few additions to the 1906 regulation reflect the increased professionalization of the management of archaeology in the empire. Thus, the new regulation went beyond simply requiring the registration of finds into special registries as seen with the 1884 regulation, to also requesting their deposition at a designated place in the excavation area for safekeeping. Overall, in the case of archaeological research, the excavation circular, that is, the 1874 regulation, held a central position in the development of the Ottoman regime on antiquities. And this is contrary to what we notice with the ownership and export of antiquities, in which case it is the 1884 regulation that played a key role. Now, if regulating archaeological research and the ownership and export of antiquities primarily reflect an Ottoman preoccupation with foreign activities in the country, the protection of the material remains of the past reveals the Ottomans' genuine interest in and care for antiquities. Already in the 1869 regulation, one can find elements of antiquities protection. The first Ottoman law on antiquities banned any intervention to antiquities to be found overground and linked this to punishment according to law. Similarly, the 1874 regulation banned the complete or partial destruction of antiquities, whether in public or private lands, and linked this to the penal code and punishments that included not only the payment of compensation, but imprisonment as well. Both the 1884 and the 1906 regulations included similar prohibitions to destroying antiquities. Yet the Ottoman state was fast in moving even further in the protection of antiquities, at least on legal paper. Thus, in the 1874 regulation, a clause sanctioned the state to designate public servants for guarding archaeological sites of importance when located in private lands. The 1884 regulation, however, reversed this in what seems to be related to the underfinancing of archaeology in the empire. Therefore, the 1884 regulation created an obligation not for the state, but for individuals and communities in possession of lands or buildings where antiquities were found to preserve them. Also, it introduced another important series of protective restrictions. The regulation banned the construction of lime kilns in the vicinity of ancient sites, raising scaffolding on monuments, removing stones that lay on the ground, even making copies of antiquities or using antiquities as, for example, habitation and for various agricultural reasons. The 1906 regulation echoed its predecessor in protecting antiquities from destruction and harm. Overall, although the Ottoman state showed an interest in protecting antiquities right from the beginning, I would say that it was the 1884 regulation that it was able to establish a more solid framework. Now, for me, it is really fascinating to follow the Ottoman efforts to manage antiquities in the empire. So far, we've seen what the law said, but how about implementation? For the authorities in Constantinople and the provinces, this was a time of shrinking borders, limited finances, and a lack of technology that could facilitate effective control over the empire's every little corner of archaeological significance. One, therefore, should not expect a seamless and smooth implementation of archaeological legislation. Instead, in spite of efforts, law enforcement could be erratic and inconsistent. But let's have a better look at it with the use of specific examples. The greatest challenge related to the 1869 regulation was that it formally introduced for foreign petitioners a system for authorizing archaeological research that bypassed the Ministry of Public Education and relied on the Sultan's decision. This stipulation is castigated in literature, but I argue that it also created a window of opportunity for the Ottomans to introduce standards, processes, and practices more advantageous to their interests than the ones the regulation afforded them. Archival sources document the addition, thanks to the Sultan-based system, of monitoring excavations, sharing fines, and imposing time limits to permits that otherwise would have been impossible to enforce, as the law did not refer to them. The 1874 regulation provides a mixed picture as to its uniform implementation. The archival record documents instances when the law was strictly followed and others when it was shown little consideration. Individuals applying for permission to excavate acknowledged the law. For example, in 1878, writing on behalf of Mr. Freshfield from London, who wished to excavate in Ephesus, Mr. D'Alessio from Constantinople explicitly mentioned that Mr. Freshfield would be willing to accept the necessary stipulations. In line with the regulation, the petitioner even made sure to include a rough sketch of the prospective excavation location. The authorization given to the German heir to the throne in December 1874, allowing him to conduct excavations in Pergamon and the surrounding area, confirms that the Ottoman authorities valued the implementation of the law. Not only did they follow its spirit and letter, but were also able to impose stricter rules than the ones envisaged in the regulation regarding the key issue of the sharing of finds. Instead of a tripartite division of ancient artifacts, the Imperial Museum was entitled to all discoveries, while the German prince was only allowed to make copies. However, following the law was not always the case. When foreign policy considerations weighed heavily in decision-making, and colonial powers engaged in fierce competition between them for antiquities in Ottoman lands, then for the Ottomans, bypassing the 1874 regulation could actually be seen as the only way through. This is what we notice in the case of the authorization provided in 1879 to French consul de Sarzec, who wished to conduct excavations in Mesopotamia. By addressing their petition directly to Foreign Minister Papatheodorou Pasha, the French, from the beginning, neglected the regulation, which invited all interested parties to acquire authorization by submitting their petition directly or through the local authorities to the Ministry of Public Education. The tone of the petition was formal, yet the French ambassador did not fail to include a personal invocation to the minister to kindly inform the Sultan of the French request. This invocation confirmed the attempt of the French legation to ignore the role of the Ministry of Public Education, which a letter written later that summer clearly expressed by highlighting the need to avoid, and I quote, the bureaucratic formalities. Also, it confirmed the wish to frame the authorization process as a foreign policy issue to be dealt with from the beginning at the ministerial level, and here I mean foreign ministries. This is reinforced by the explicit request for equal treatment with Great Britain, which a few months earlier had been granted permission to excavate throughout Mesopotamia in the name of Sir Henry Layard. As for the text of the authorization to Consul de Sarzec, this contained a number of clauses that contradicted and others that upheld the 1874 regulation. For example, the fact that permission to excavate was granted to the French consul in Basra was in direct contrast to the regulation, which forbade public servants of foreign governments, such as Consul de Sarzec, to excavate within the area of their jurisdiction. Similarly, de Sarzec was allowed to excavate throughout Mesopotamia, whereas the regulation stipulated that authorization could be provided for research limited to a village or a town. On the other hand, in line with the regulation, de Sarzec's excavations were conditioned on the consent of the landowner in the case of private lands. Now, time does not allow me to delve into all authorization clauses in detail, but one cannot fail to notice that overall, the regulation was followed only on issues of lesser importance to the French, who wished to excavate in as many locations as possible and secure as many finds as possible. And this was previously the case also with the British. Now, for the period introduced with the 1884 regulation, the archival record allows us to reconstruct a varied picture as to the implementation of the regulation. I do not wish to argue that the law was completely neglected. Yet, budgetary issues hindered the effective monitoring of sites and undermined the collection of ancient artifacts. Another major challenge was combating illegal digs and the flourishing black market in antiquities in the vast expanse of the empire. Theodore Macready, whom we see here on the picture, commissary at the Imperial Museum, argued from Raqqa that the entire population, from the Kaimakam and his last employee to the gendarmerie and everybody else, was involved in illegal excavations and trade in antiquities. Significantly, he spoke of thousands of holes from illegal digs within the city walls, and of his complaints to the representative of the Kaimakam about an illegal dig which he had personally witnessed being met with indifference. Illegal digs and traffic in antiquities were complemented by the use of ancient sites as sources of free construction material by local populations. Significantly, the use of ancient slabs in construction was a well-established pattern of recycling building material that dated back hundreds of years, if not more. This might explain Macready's firmness when confronted with such cases. In a letter to Halil Bey, deputy director of the Imperial Museum from 1904, he urged that, and I quote, "It is absolutely necessary that I go to Notion," that's Gyaurköy or Christianköy to the south of present-day Izmir, to see what is going on there. The priest of the village, Papa Dimitri, together with a certain Dimitri who is a vakil, a representative of the church, and a grocer named Stathi, were digging to get stones required for building a new church." Unquote. Indeed, this long-standing tradition could have dire consequences for monuments. In another letter dated in 1902, Theodore Macready spoke of the quarry of Kanawat in present-day Syria and Soweida in Hauran. Soweida, I don't know exactly where it is, but Hauran, I understand it's in between Syria and Jordan, which the Druze would visit in order to select the stone slabs that suited their needs, remove entire sculpted gates, and break sculptures into pieces. High politics also played an important role in undermining the proper implementation of the 1884 regulation. The way that Sultan Abdul Hamid II exercised his prerogatives in those years illustrates this well, with geopolitical considerations weighing heavily in bypassing the 1884 regulation. Thus, for example, the foreign policy objective of harnessing good ties with Germany and Austria-Hungary, resulting in neglecting the Ottoman archaeological legislation in the case of excavations at Ephesus. Similarly, a secret agreement with Germany, signed in 1899, provided for the equal sharing of finds between the two countries, contrary to the regulation that stipulated complete Ottoman ownership. However, when the geopolitical interests of his country were not at stake, the Sultan was more willing to heed the advice of his administration in charge of antiquities. After 1906, all themes continued to have a significant impact on the implementation of the new law. For example, the Sultan would again not shy away from bypassing the law when confronted with pressing foreign policy issues. In 1906, he thus granted the Germans the right to export half of the finds from their excavation at Miletus. Illicit digs and traffic in antiquities continued to cause major headaches to the Ottoman authorities. Let's have again a look at Raqqa. Surviving documents exchanged between the governor, the Vali of Aleppo, the Imperial Museum, the Ministry of Public Education, and the Ministry of Interior allow one to follow illicit activities regarding antiquities in the province of Aleppo, and in particular Raqqa, after 1910 and up to the outbreak of the First World War, 4 years later. These documents reveal a recycling of arguments about the need to protect antiquities, and the inability of the state authorities, be they attached to the central government or local administration, to do so. Estimated at a few 100,000 liras, illicit traffic in antiquities in this province was a major source of income for locals who engaged in it on a rather vast scale, as we read in one of the documents. Illegal digs could go on for days in a row, and involve many people, as the following excerpt from a telegram sent by the Kaimakam of Raqqa and quoted in a document illustrates. And I quote, "For the past 3-4 days, many locals, even women and children, go to the ruins of Raqqa to look for antiquities, and it has been made known that they have stolen objects of considerable value." Unquote. The inability of local security forces to intervene was beyond doubt. In Raqqa, the Kaimakam argued that the gendarmerie had turned a blind eye and taken no measures against these unlawful acts, as undoubtedly had been happening for years, because of its forces being numerically insufficient. Indeed, an incident described by the Governor-General of Aleppo, Hussein Kazim, in December 1910, shows that looters would, at times, go as far as to use violence against the gendarmerie and engage in serious fighting. When one takes into consideration the expanse of the province of Aleppo, the difficulties of traveling in its desert, and reaching its many remote places that in the documents studied are characterized as being away from civilization, the challenges that local authorities were confronted with become clearer. While evading the issue of increasing the capacity of the gendarmerie, the local authorities insisted on the appointment of guardians to archaeological sites and ruins. In contrast, the Imperial Museum considered local government fully responsible for law enforcement, and in particular for not giving way to illegal digs, for arresting and bringing to justice those who acted contrary to the regulation on antiquities, for getting hold of finds, and for preventing any damage to antiquities. Also, the Imperial Museum considered it impossible to conduct excavations in all, and there were many, places of archaeological importance in the vast territorial expanse of the empire, and that it was beyond its means to appoint guardians in all sites. With the Ministries of Public Education and Interior acting as messengers, the Imperial Museum and the local government in Aleppo engaged themselves in an unproductive exchange of arguments that appeared to aim at persuading the other side to do what it considered impossible. Although while doing this, the Ottoman administrative elite at the central and local levels showed itself aware of the issues at stake and of various limitations in addressing it, it also made manifest its inability, at least at that particular moment, to work out a feasible and effective solution. Now, so far, we've seen the goals and key content of Ottoman archaeological legislation, as well as law implementation. Yet the Ottoman Empire was not the only country in the world to develop archaeological legislation in the long 19th century, though it was one of the first ones. It would be impossible to compare it with all other countries that did, but it is interesting to see where it stood in relation to its neighboring Greece, another major country of origin of antiquities, and Great Britain, the colonial power par excellence in those years. A comparison with the archaeological regime of Greece shows that the Ottomans were in a position to benefit from Greek legislation. Significantly, Ottoman interest in the way the Greek kingdom managed its archaeological affairs was not new, and focused on the challenges that foreign activities posed, as well as archaeological heritage protection. As early as 1875, the Ottoman government had expressed its interest in the Greek case when the Meclisi Kebiri Ma'arif, while discussing potential modifications to the 1874 regulation, took seriously into consideration the conditions for excavations that the Greek kingdom had stipulated. Although the workings of the Meclisi Kebiri Ma'arif were inconclusive, Greece continued to serve as a model for the Ottoman state. In his speech at the opening of the tiled pavilion, the Chenili Köşk, in August 1880, Minister of Public Education Munif Pasha made recourse to the Greek case for, and I quote, "At present, even though they spend large amounts of money for archaeological research in Greece, European states do not transfer antiquities to their countries, and the finds are preserved in Athens." Unquote. More than this, specific provisions in the 1884 regulation were actually based on the Greek law of antiquities, dated 1834. Article 5 of the Ottoman Regulation of 1884, which dealt with the protection of monuments, was to a large extent a translation of Article 85 of the Greek law of 1834, except for paragraph epsilon e. Thus, both laws banned landowners from destroying monuments, ancient roads, etc. that were located on their properties, and forbade the construction of lime kilns within less than 250 meters from a monument. Also, they prohibited landowners from executing any kind of activity around a monument, if that would cause harm or damage to it, from removing stones from the ground where antiquities were found, and from erecting scaffolding on monuments with a view to measuring them, sketching them, or for other similar reasons. Finally, they forbade the reuse of antiquities as habitation, depots, for watering animals, etc. For the first time, an Ottoman regulation on antiquities attempted to put an end, in a targeted manner, to all economic and scholarly activities that could pose a risk to a monument. And in doing this, unexpectedly perhaps, it used the Greek law of 1834 as a source. This, I must add, is just one example out of several that refer not only to the 1884 regulation, but the 1906 one as well, and we can discuss later if you want. Unlike the Greek and Ottoman archaeological legislations, the ancient monument legislation in Great Britain and the regulations on antiquities in the Ottoman Empire developed in rather independent ways. And that, despite the fact that the development of museums in the major European countries had mobilized the Ottomans in their archaeological policies. In fact, one could have anticipated the Ottomans to have shown an interest in legal developments concerning the protection of ancient monuments in Great Britain, given a relative tradition of borrowing from European law in the Tanzimat period and afterwards. But again, this doesn't seem to have been the case. Surprisingly, perhaps, the Ottomans and not the British were first in codifying their archaeological policy in law, as seen with the 1869 regulation. Following a decade of deliberations, London enacted its first Ancient Monuments Protection Act in 1882, that is, 13 years after Constantinople. The Ottomans could perhaps have taken an interest in it, but the content of archaeological legislation in the two empires shows that this did not really happen. For the British based their protection system inter alia on the consent of the owner of the monument and the concept of a schedule of monuments. Thus, whereas the Ottoman legislation provided an explicit list of prohibitions to the individuals or communities in whose land antiquities were to be found, the British law conditioned protection on the willingness of the monument owner to have it scheduled, namely included on the list of monuments under state protection. As one reads in the English law, the expression ancient monuments to which this act applies means the monuments described in the schedule hereto, and any other monuments of a like character of which the commissioners of works at the request of the owners thereof may consent to become guardians, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the two legal systems for antiquities, the one in the Ottoman Empire and the one in Great Britain, developed different tools based on a different set of assumptions and different premises. In sum, and to conclude my talk, the Ottoman legislation on antiquities aimed at addressing both pressure from foreign actors and domestic challenges. It evolved gradually, building a regime on antiquities that promoted the state as the main, if not the sole, guardian of the material remains of past civilizations. Although in those years legal borrowings tended to come from advanced European countries, in the case of the Ottoman antiquities legislation, surprisingly perhaps, or maybe not, and I know that this sounds strange when it comes from a Greek, inspiration would come from Greece. So I hope you have enjoyed this talk. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Artemis. We now have time for questions. So I'll go first to the people in the room. We do have a couple of online questions that we'll get to subsequently. Does anyone have a question in the room? Okay, Sam.
Thank you, Artemis, for this fascinating lecture. So my question relates both to today's lecture and to your ongoing project that revolves around indigenous archaeologies. And you've already touched upon the ways in which these new regulations limited locals' interaction with like archaeological sites and antiquities. And I guess I'm curious to know whether any of the sources that you're like sort of looking into reveal any insights into local perspectives and how the locals kind of perceived of these like changes.
Yes, thank you for this question. Do we take a round of questions or no? Okay. Thank you for this. Let me first say that the material I'm able to study on vernacular indigenous archaeology is like ordinary people's perception of antiquities dates from the very final decades of the Ottoman Empire. And this is a period fraught with political tension. And I'm working on Ottoman Greeks. So we need to bear this at the back of our mind. Now, ordinary people, at least Ottoman Greeks, but I believe others too, give us a very mixed picture of engaging with antiquities. There are those who could go as far as destroy a find because, you know, it was in the middle of their plot of land and they wanted to build a watering canal and they just destroyed it because they had to, so they thought. But there are many others, both men and women, who are very sensitive, not in this intellectualized way that very well-educated people working in the Imperial Museum and elsewhere in the administration would have been. And they're curious and they get moved by antiquities around them. There is, for example, this Ottoman Greek, a man who goes to the local church and discovers that the icon, one of the icons, has the first layer has peeled off from, I don't know for what reason, humidity. And he discovers another icon underneath. And he's interviewed about life in his home village in Anatolia some 40, 50 years later. And he's still able to remember that. So that left an imprint on him. It was important for him. There's this lady, I think she's from Lithri, Ildur, Anastasia Andreadak. I keep using this example because I'm fascinated by her, who walks around in her village and sees the ancient quay, which has now sunk in the sea, and she wonders, when did that happen? So she starts thinking about it. This is not something you necessarily expect from a woman who barely finished primary school, but she does. Now, for the more political aspects, and again, we need to remember when these people experienced antiquities around them at the very end of the empire. Some will tell you that they distrust the Ottoman authorities. At some point, there's this story. It might be Lithri again. I don't remember very well. There's a Greek from Greece who has settled there for unknown reasons. And he thinks that it is appropriate to inform the Ottoman authorities, that's the Greek from Greece, about the existence of some finds. They had made a new discovery, but there were also some other finds in the village. They had placed those in the konak. And the Ottoman authorities come and take not just the new finds, they take everything. And the local Ottoman Greek is very sad about it, because he says they were in their home place, these antiquities, and who knows where they're going to end up now. we don't trust the authorities. They're going to sell them to the market. They have a very derogatory understanding of what the Ottoman authorities could do with antiquities. I'm not saying that this is accurate, but that was their perception. And on the other hand, they look up to the Greek mandate authorities in Smyrna to come and protect antiquities. They're okay for the mandate authorities to take antiquities to Smyrna for their museum. So, but again, that's the very end of the empire. I don't have information about the 1870s or the 1880s. But also there is at least one testimony in the archive I've come across that shows Christians, Ottoman Greeks, valuing Islamic antiquities in the Ayasoluk area. I think that Islamic antiquities there are from the Seljuk period. And there's this guy who, it's his own initiative, he says, and there are those beautiful baths and other antiquities from the Islamic conquest period or something like that. And I like them a lot, something like that.
Okay, I was wondering, thank you very much for the lecture. I was wondering whether illicit digging was already defined from the very beginning onwards.
You mean in legislation?
In the legislation, yes.
It's not there in the 1869 regulation. I don't remember about the 1874 regulation. I need to check. Specifically defined. I need to check about the 1870. I need to check when it's defined for the first time. I don't remember. I can do it now.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, I'll go first.
Thank you very much, Artemis. I just wanted to ask a very short follow-up question to Gizem's, and I love the question, I love the answer. How do we hear the local people's voices? How do we access this information? Who interviewed them? Who wrote these things?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to listen to the voice of ordinary people, especially in archaeological terms from that period. So this is actually the voice of Ottoman Greek refugees who settled in Greece after 1922. And there was this center, the Center for Asia Minor Studies. It still exists in Athens. And this woman, an ethnomusicologist, who decided to put together an oral tradition and an early oral history project with many ethnographic overtones, if I may say so. Now, for them, for the center, antiquity is very important because, they fell in that category of Hellenism in Anatolia, in Asia Minor. It is an interesting thing. The answers that the refugees give may subvert that initial approach thinking. They talk a lot about Byzantine monuments, more than about ancient Greek. Yeah.
It is on. Okay. I just have a question kind of about context, you could say. So, because in my experience, when I'm looking at heritage laws in other countries, they seem to appear, or they seem to become more stringent either in two situations. One is when a country is basically building itself, so it's trying to establish its heritage and trying to build its narrative. Or alternatively, when they feel that the heritage representing the country is becoming very threatened. So they try and become more stringent. And so my gut feeling is that with the laws that you outlined in the late Ottoman Empire, it's the latter scenario. They're seeing increasing threats to the country itself and the heritage that it represents. Do you see any sort of explicit statements like that coming through in the documents you've looked at?
I would say that it is both. Textually, it is more what you say, but contextually, it is also an effort to build an imperial identity that would be established as far as archaeology is concerned on the Greco-Roman past. There were so many Greco-Roman monuments in the empire that would be based on the Greco-Roman past, which was so popular and the one really acceptable in the West, and would help the Ottomans also make themselves acceptable in the West. But I have to say something. If we start looking if we move from the administration, from the state, and we start looking into the society, it's not just let's become acceptable to foreigners. It is building an identity of who we want to be in modern times. That's especially the case about Ottoman Greeks, the more educated ones, upper middle classes. They work a lot on antiquities. And it's quite of an organic connection. They feel that they're doing it, first of all, for themselves, to advance themselves, not only to show themselves to others as being, I don't know, civilized or something like that. In the case of the state, this is less clear. It is a lot about what foreigners are going to say, even though I do sometimes think that this is an argument put forth by certain administrators in the museum and around the museum that would make their positions more palatable to people higher up in the state administration that had no direct link in their everyday duties with antiquities. So let's make sure that foreigners don't accuse us of being uncivilized. But I think that people who worked in the museum and the society, the Ottoman society, at least the Ottoman Greeks I've looked into in detail, they're doing it perhaps more for themselves.
Thanks, all right. Thanks a lot, Artemis, for this brilliant lecture. One of the things that was very interesting for me is to see that in 1906, you say the position of the imperial. Okay.
I hope you can hear me. Okay. So you say in 1906 regulation, the position of the Imperial Museum was elevated, different from the previous one, which kind of gave more authority to the Ministry of Public Education. And I wonder how you interpret this transformation in terms of perhaps a centralization policy, perhaps in terms of the power of the agents like Osman Hamdi or Halil Ethem in the Imperial Museum. And the second question is, do you see kind of a similar move in Greece that kind of perhaps place more importance to the museum rather than the public education, Ministry of Public Education?
I'll start with the second question. I cannot really tell about Greece because I haven't studied it, but Greece had a different administrative structure on antiquities. It was based on ephorates, not on museums. This is a major difference between Greece and the Ottoman Empire. In spite of all the similarities we discussed today, this is a major difference, and it continues to these days, the way I understand it. As for the first question, this was a gradual build-up of the museum, the Imperial Museum, as a locus of power in archaeological affairs. It shows clearly for the first time that the museum is trying to turn itself into the central administrative body for antiquities in the empire with the 1889 regulation, internal regulation of the museum. There, it sets up an administration for itself that actually shows that it has a vision to bring the entire country under its control, to conduct excavations pretty much everywhere, if possible, to establish annexes, like not exactly annexes, I don't think they call them annexes, but other museums in the provinces. So they see for themselves a coordinating role in antiquities. I think that this has a lot to do with Osman Hamdi Bey and people around him who can support him in this vision of his, Halilatam, Makridi Bey, and others. And 1906 is a period when Osman Hamdi Bey has been around for a very long time, from the early 1880s. He's mature. He knows very well his job. He has established himself, both the way I understand it, within the Ottoman administration and with foreigners who come to the empire for reasons that have to do with antiquities. And 1906 is the golden chance for him.
Okay, I better take some questions from Zoom because there are several people waiting patiently online. Actually, the last question we had from Harrison Potter was asking if there are any notable academic individual who was conducting excavations in the Ottoman Empire who had a particular role in trying to guide Ottoman legislation, or was it mainly developed by a range of bodies? You just mentioned Osman Hamdi Bey, but perhaps there's someone else you would like to mention.
The Ottoman Empire did not have a school of archaeology, even though it tried to set up one. So somebody from within the country who would have been trained in an Ottoman school of archaeology and who could have done this, it didn't exist. This example does not exist. Osman Hamdi Bey, from what we know from the work of people like Hatem Eldem and others, Osman Hamdi Bey was himself helped, sort of trained in archaeology by, if I remember correctly, Salomon Reynard. Now, there's a funny thing here. Salomon Reynard is one of those people who reacts to the 1884 regulation because he sees it as the duplication of some sort of the Greek very, very restrictive archaeological legislation that has a lot to do with his opinion about whether exports should be banned or not. He's not of the opinion that they should be banned because he makes an argument that this supports illegal digging and illegal trafficking.
Okay, so several other questions. Ahmed asks, how did the Ottomans define antiquities? Did the law refer to a specific time frame?
The definitions on antiquities in the legislation are quite vague until 1906. This is when we get, also from what I recall, the first time limit as well. I think it's the 17th century. And also this is when we also start having more specific examples. And also when we start seeing Islamic antiquities being elevated, being singled out from the rest of antiquities.
Okay. Now there's a very long question, which I'll do my best to narrate. So Stephen Sim writes, in other quote unquote imperial countries, the establishment of national museums located within their capital cities always postdated private interests and private associations concerned with archaeological antiquities. It was the same with laws intended to protect archaeological sites that were passed as a result of internal pressure by citizens concerned about the preservation of antiquities. No such pre-established entities existed within the Ottoman Empire. For this reason, how could a genuine interest in or care about antiquities by the Ottoman state lie behind Ottoman legislation concerning antiquities? Indeed, would not scholarly research by Ottoman citizens into the Ottoman Empire's Roman, Greek, Byzantine, or Armenian pasts have been considered a subversive act? Were the laws concerning antiquities, like many of the Ottoman Empire's laws, nothing more than words for show and words to be ignored?
Yeah, that's a long question. I think there are three main points here. I'm trying to remember the first one. Yes, actually, yes, there was a museum, a nucleus of a museum before the 1869 regulation on antiquities in the empire. So, like in the countries that the Eastern participant has in mind, the Ottoman Empire too had attempted to create a museum first in Airini, and also there was discussion as part of these attempts on how best to regulate archaeological activity in the country, how to the empire, how to collect antiquities, and so on and so forth.
I think that the questioner wanted to know if there were private initiatives to create like collections to collect antiquities and to protect antiquities before the state stepped in.
There was one I can discuss. There were the efforts of the Hellenic Literary Society at Constantinople, which was created in the early 1860s, and from early on it started collecting antiquities. So that's before the legislation, but it's not necessarily before. It's not before the Ottoman Empire itself started collecting antiquities. Yes, there is this one. Later on, we have more. In Palestine, there are missionaries, schools, and other private collections. In Smyrna, we have the Evangelical School, the main Greek Orthodox high school, which has a museum. In Rodosto, in Tekirdağ, there is, if I remember correctly, a Greek association, Ottoman Greek association, that likewise collects antiquities. So there are many actors who collect antiquities. At least one of them started before the first Ottoman regulation.
Okay, thanks. There's a couple more questions online, shorter ones. John Fiddler asks, what about French law? Does that play a role?
I have only come across a reference to the French Museum, but nothing more than this. Just a reference in the French, in the first regulation in the preamble, where they say, oh no, it's not the first regulation. It's before that, when they discuss about having a legislation on antiquities, and one of the officials involved in the deliberations brings up the French Museum as an example, but he doesn't elaborate. And I haven't come across anything on the archival material I have studied so far on the French, but also French legislation, like a specific law. I think this also comes after the Ottoman. There were initiatives before that, but a law as such, I think, comes after the first Ottoman one.
Okay. Susan Walker asks, how was the international art market in Smyrna, Izmir regulated at this time?
Oh my God, I think that there are people in this room more knowledgeable than me to answer this. I'm afraid I don't know about the international art market in Smyrna. I haven't come across anything in the archive, so I'm afraid I cannot answer this question. But I think that there is at least one article that deals with Ottoman antiquities in the Ottoman Empire. Perhaps was it Islamic antiquities and the international art market? So there are people who have done work on this.
Suna Guven asks if there is anything in the legislation related to the rights to publish or studies of specific antiquities.
Yeah, when with the 1884 regulation, they forbid ownership of finds by third parties. Only the state can own finds, archaeological artifacts. This is when they give the excavators the right to study the finds, to make copies, and so on and so forth. They don't specifically mention publish, but there's a thing here. They don't make the study of the finds that a specific excavator, the discoveries that a specific excavator has made, exclusive to him, at least for a number of years. So you excavate, you pay all that money, and then anybody can come. The finds are going to be at the Imperial Museum, and anybody can come and study them from day one. in theory at least. So that was something that foreign archaeologists had pointed out to and were a little bit bitter about.
Okay. Batuhan Ozdemir asks, was there any official perception of antiquities in the Ottoman Empire prior to the first legislation promulgated in 1868?
I'm not sure I understand the official perception of antiquities, what this could be, but there were many discussions about antiquities and how best to protect them, especially from the hands of foreigners. But again, this is the state, because if we look at the society, and again my research talks about Ottoman Greeks, then we have a very broad understanding of antiquities that extend from prehistory to the Islamic civilization.
Okay. Roxana Coman congratulates you on your talk and asks, are there any was there any legislation related to artifacts that were destined for international expositions? Were there regulations around?
I haven't come across anything.
And also whether there was any training of individuals to become archaeologists in this period?
Well, as I said before, there was no school of archaeology in the empire. However, people working in the Imperial Museum could actually get hands-on experience on the side of foreign, very well-trained university professor archaeologists. And this is something that happened a lot in Ottoman times, especially in the latter years. So they would go and spend time next to acclaimed foreign archaeologists, and they would learn by doing.
Okay. Renu Parek asks if the legislation envisaged retrieving antiquities that had been illegally smuggled out of the country.
The legislation did not, from what I've seen, but in reality they did, and at least in the very, very popular case of Schliemann's excavations in Troya. So there was a legal case at the courts of Athens against Schliemann by the Ottoman state. There is very little information on this in the Greek archives, but this is one very illustrative case when the Ottoman state went behind somebody who had exported finds illegally.
Okay, fascinating. Boaz Greece asked, what were the foreign excavators' views of these Ottoman laws? You mentioned one.
They were not particularly happy with after 1884, when things got really restricted for them, they were not particularly happy, and they could go from expressing their dissatisfaction in careful ways to being quite explicit.
Okay. I think that's all of the questions for now from the online audience. Anyone in the room have a final question, or should we break up and have some refreshments?
I only want to add something for the long question.
Yes.
One of the big private collector in Ottoman Empire was Baltazi family. So we haven't seen the collection only in the museums. Baltazi excavated Küme, one of the most important Aeolus tea. So
yeah, I would like to check whether Osman Hamdi Bey himself was not a collector of antiquities.
yes,
I have there are some indications that he was actually that he actually had a collection himself. And in the law, in the first law, and then again quite late in Ottoman legislation, we see that the state sort of sanctions an antiquities market But it's interesting, you know, that in the 1906 law, for example, it sanctions an antiquities market. It doesn't really say anything about private collections, which is strange.
Okay, I think we can conclude there. Thanks so much, Artemis. This was
Thank you.
really fascinating. And for everyone in the room, there's refreshments at the end of the hall. And for everyone online, I don't know, make yourself a cup of tea and ponder. But thanks for attending. And if you follow us, you'll see there are several other lectures coming up in the next 2 weeks. I think one a week for the next 2 weeks. Thanks again. Bye.